Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. The current event by the Center Free Crimea is held jointly with the Ukraine Crisis Media Center and is dedicated to a title to be published by Bright Book Publishers, and it will be presented on the 11th of September at Lviv Book Fair. It will be the first documentary story of the Crimea annexation, starting from 18th of February until 14th of March of 2014. The book itself is rather strongly based on facts and documents. 704 open sources have been used, and the book has 392 pages, and there was quite a substantial team of experts working on the title, and I was the one who made the final compiling of it. I would like to thank to the Free Crimea Center, our media representatives and journalists, Chirna, Pokrovska, Dupak, Makata, Stopchuk, and many others for their valuable contributions. The title has been written with proper regard to 40 personal interviews that I and Victoria Cheva made, to include Russian and Ukrainian political figures, international experts, also military experts, and surely those who lived personally throughout this tragedy to tell their stories. The book contains a number of materials not published before on aspects of hybrid war waged by Russia, and early signs of this hybrid war concept starting from '91. And I'm glad to present here some of the experts who participated in the creation of this title. These are the people who shared their valuable insights. Meet Georgiy Logvynskyi, MP, an MP who was at the time of annexation there, who knows the story all too well. Also welcome Sevgil Musaeva-Borovik, editor-in-chief of Ukrainska, pravda. She also remembers the events of the period. Head of Krym.Reality's program, Olexandr Iankovskiy. At that time he was the director of Chernomorka broadcasting companies, subsequently banished by Russians, and Dmytro Tymchuk, far less known that at the time of the annexation and enjoying much wider repute also because of his Facebook materials. And the title is largely based on reminiscences of Dmytro. And we've been heavily quoting from Dmytro's Facebook posts in this regard, because for many of us, the whole story started with his posts with the latest information for the time being. Many other reputed experts participated in the creation of the book. Akhtisy Tablayev, merited artist of the Crimea, Shura Ryazantseva, she was kidnapped and tortured. Olexandr Iankovskiy, I already presented him, and a friend of mine, Mr. Medvedev, he's having a birthday today. My personal mission was to share my personal experiences of the period, because the Crimea is my motherland, and I still have many close friends and relatives and people close to me living there, and I could not step aside in this situation from the tragedy. So I did my best to partake in the creation of the book, and it's up to the readership audience to judge what is the result. Now I'd like to give the floor to Olexandr Iankovskiy, whom we had a chance to become acquainted with because of the tragic event, and we've made friends and partners ever since because of shared visions of the Ukrainian government.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I wanted to say just a couple of words because bigger part of my memories is reflected in the book, but the main conclusion to which I came after all these events is that the Russians come to those destinations in Ukraine where there is a lack of real Ukrainians. I think that the major reason of the events in Crimea was that there was no critical mass of real Ukrainians on the eve before the conquest of the building of the administrative buildings in Simferopol. There was a huge meeting of pro-Ukrainian forces. For me, the turning point was the morning of March 1st. By that moment, I did not believe that it was possible for the Russian troops to occupy the Verkhovna Rada of Crimea, the Supreme Council of Crimea. But in the morning, at 6 a.m., I saw the armored vehicles of the Russian armored vehicles, and when I saw these heavy vehicles going along the city streets, I was shocked, and I saw the Russian soldiers who looked at me via the sides of the machine guns from that armored vehicles. And this brought me to understanding that the Russian army comes to that destinations, to that locations where people do not feel themselves as Ukrainian citizens. Now I would like to give the floor to the Member of Parliament, to a leader of the information counteraction project, Dmytro Tymchuk. So the most commonly asked question is why the Ukrainian military did not open fire in Crimea. Yeah. Thank you. The biggest question which has been being discussed in the context of the annexation of Crimea is whether we surrendered Crimea with a shame or there was no other way out. I think that our information counteraction group was founded in 2008 in September, and we have launched our first project, the Navy of 2017. We have established our community of experts after the Georgian war, and we understood that we should follow up the situation with the Russian Navy based in Ukrainian territory in Crimea. We believed that the Georgian scenario could be repeated in Crimea. What is surprising is that under both Yushchenko and Yanukovych, the major military doctrine was based on the presumption that we do not have enemies, that we should have just a contract-based army. But when we started to study the situation in Crimea, we understood a huge scale of work carried out by the Russian special forces. And there was a special FSB unit working in Crimea. It was part of the Russian fleet in the Crimea. What was surprising that Ukrainian special services, understanding the threat coming from that units and forces working in Ukraine, only several years later, back in 2009, at the end of 2009, Ukrainian authorities requested to withdraw the FSB units from Ukraine, and when Yanukovych came to power, half a year later, those FSB units again appeared in Ukraine. For example, this FSB organization founded famous plot organization, which now became one of the terrorist groups working in Donbass. Actually, Ukrainian special forces did not sufficiently counteract to FSB units. Under Yanukovych, unfortunately, the activities of Russian special forces was uncontrolled. By the way, under Yanukovych, the main intelligence department actively worked in Crimea. They worked openly. They were visually seen from the headquarters of the Ukrainian Navy. They were absolutely clearly putting the antennas and intercepting all the commands, all the talks of Ukrainian Navy command, and we had Crimean Autonomous Republic and special services of Ukraine work there, but our work there was never made legal. That we cooperated with local special Ukrainian forces, but actually they comprised Crimean residents with a specific ideological attitudes. And our communication with the real patriots of Ukraine in Crimea allowed us to build up a system and be able to monitor activities of the Russian special forces. When the occupation of Crimea started, we immediately launched our X group. There was informational counter action. I sent a letter to the National Security and Defense Council. Actually, I received an answer from them saying that they do not need our support. At that very time, the Russian propaganda, or better to say disinformation about events in Ukraine, was working very powerfully, and in late February, early March 2014, Russian mass media described that the local self-defense tried to protect local residents from Ukrainian fascists, that Hetman Sagaidachny flagship was ready to attack the Crimea while it was in the Atlantic Ocean at that time. So they tried to use our resources and to counteract that propaganda. We had been studying the situation in Crimea since 2008, and from the very beginning of the events in 2014, we understood that this was a special operation of the Russian Federation. For us, it remained a mystery why Ukrainian authorities did not give an order to open fire or to counteract. At the very beginning, we believed that the authorities tried to prevent escalation and suffering of local population or escalation of relations with Russia. Then later, communicating with the middle-level commanders, we understood that nobody tried to prevent Ukrainian military from actions. We have the statutes of the soldiers and of military units which prescribe the soldiers to act specifically in specific situations. When the conquests of the military units started, we got a confirmation that the central authorities ordered the military to open fire in necessary cases. That is, the Ukrainian military were not willing to open fire in Crimea. For ourselves, we explained it in the following way. So the main problem was in the general situation. It was immediately after Maidan events. There was almost anarchy situation. The enforcement agencies were demoralized. The head of the heads of the enforcement agencies, which were appointed by Yanukovych government, they simply disappeared, and many of them simply convinced leaders of the military units not to offense against Russians. And for example, the story with Berezovets. His family was detained and he was simply blackmailed, and he had to betray Ukraine, but he made this under pressure. But having analyzed his orders, we found out that he ordered to withdraw Ukrainian ships from some base where they were based, and he also ordered to block the Kerch ferry line, and also some military units already were sent to the Kerch ferry line. So actually that orders were very adequate, but from some moment in time he turned 180 degrees back, and the situation worsened. As of today, I don't wish to blame somebody, because I realize that my information is not full, but my question is to the special forces and to the leaders of the state who know all the information. My question is to them: what is the official version of the events in Crimea? At the same time, we understand that the format which was used by the Russians, the hybrid war, the special operation scenario, it was later applied to the east of Ukraine. But we never saw the glory of the Russian weapon, which appeared to be a false story.
Starting from the moment when Ukraine began offering resistance, all the myths started to disintegrate, and we do understand that it is necessary, if it is necessary, to fight more efficiently and to fight back the imminent threat. The military doctrine of Ukraine, where Russia is stated as the chief adversary, is entirely correct to move. And given the situation in the Baltic states and the understanding of Russia's threats, I think we need to build our own understanding of the developments in the Crimea that led to its annexation, and the book by Taras, compiled by Taras, will hugely help in this. Unfortunately, volunteers are always the first to engage in the fight, with the state journey only later on. Nevertheless, this is a huge leap ahead, and we should not underestimate it. Thank you. Thank you, Dmitry. I think that at any rate, the title has all the chances of serving as a documentary proof of the annexation aggression on behalf of Russia. And one of surprising facts we discovered while writing the book came from Russian hackers who supplied information about the rigged referendum they had in the Crimea. The information contained even data and electronic mail addresses and other details, many of them with gov.ru and names. And we have certain proof that by the time when Valentina Matviyenko, the Soviet Federation of the Russian Federation, had not quorum presence to vote legally. And now I'd like to give the floor to Georgiy Logvynskyi, who probably does more than the rest of the Ukrainian government. And he is one of the key players to make sanctions against Russia work in practice. The registration of vessels, international vessels, entering Crimean ports in breach of international sanctions, and ways of their registering is also one of the things that he can be commended for. Thank you to us, and I'd like to thank everyone contributing to the restoration of our control over that territory of the Crimea. This is a huge challenge because we are facing an enemy, and the enemy with long and evil memory. Unfortunately, there is no other way around if we are conscious patriots of our own country. I'd like to tell you that the situation with the annexation of the Crimea is, while unique in itself, is nevertheless very much typical, because if we were to analyze what had happened around us before, maybe we would come up with lessons to prevent this ever from happening. And the title we present today is a kind of a Bible that can serve nicely to everyone willing to know how to counteract such threats. I'm more than sure that the situation with the Crimea is far from being over, and it can move in both directions, whether in terms of growing annexation or restoration of control. But if we are to defend our territory, if we are to make correct moves, we need to come up with a correct strategy, and it is from this that the whole restoration of the control over the Crimea depends on. When many years ago, the fascist Germany occupied territories of neighboring countries, that led to lots of stories and filmed stories on that. You remember one of the movies on that period by Steven Spielberg, and the return of Private Ryan and many others movies. Actually, I mentioned the Schindler's List movie, and it was the result of a woman who came to Spielberg to tell her story, and after Spielberg assured her he was interested in that, another man came to relate his experience of the time, and then one and one more, and that led Spielberg to establish the Shoah Foundation, based on hundreds of interviews about the occupation period. And I think the book we are discussing today is just a continuation of the efforts by this famous filmmaker, quite able to open public eye on things happening in and around the country. When the annexation was about to unfold, I was closely involved in the work of the workings of Crimean Tatar organizations, and I worked with a representative of Mustafa Dzhemilov and his lawyers on criminal matters. And early on, we decided to establish an expert council addressing all lawyers or barristers, asking them for help. To everyone we addressed, offered the services on a pro bono basis, be it Astra Integrity, be it others, be it the Institute of Religious Freedom or the Kharkiv human activism group. They've all started thinking of things practical for the survivability of the society. That is, how one is to transfer his business from the annexed territory, how to provide other steps to ensure the livelihood of those who had to either live there or leave the peninsula. And it fell well in tune with the European Court of Justice decision against Russia that recognized the annexation and fundamental threat to the basic human rights and freedoms there. It was a decision of principle, and it was the decision that was of paramount importance for us, because it involves international legal appraisal of the situation on the peninsula. Then time came for very close work with the people who were in the Crimea. It was increasingly hard to contact these people, to call them, to follow activists summoned to local prosecution officers or security services in an attempt to fight for their freedom. Anyway, we saw that the annexation was an outburst of aggression that had been thoroughly planned years before, up to the minute detail. Nice information that board guard officer presented me with in Kerch was that weeks before the annexation they had a down raid, an inspection of local military bases. The puzzling thing was that normally military inspections have always been planned to verify some specific deficiencies. But that one that I was told about, it was like just a verification, a stock taking of what's in there. And exactly when the annexation came, when the aggressor came on the land, it needed and wanted exactly this information. And when Russian invaders entered Kerch, all Ukrainian bodyguards left their positions. Just 3 bodyguards were left, only one of them having an assault rifle. This is to say that right before this invasion, someone ordered them to leave their positions and to relinquish all control. This information was later confirmed. Some bodyguard members managed to get hold of secret information, confidential information, minutes before the annexation. And the people with the secret information spent weeks trying to get to Kiev, they at times having to go on foot. Time was lost because they were sought after by Russian invaders and their henchmen. One of those who had to flee told me that his hobby has always been to make plane models, and he had to leave in a haste without being able to get his collection. And he also said me that he had a chance to find a photo when a new officer sitting in his office nowadays, were those model planes still there. This all is to say that we need to go on with sanctions. We need to explore every legal possibility to deal with it. Many times we hear officials saying that it is not possible, it is not necessary, it is fruitless. But nevertheless, at the time of the conflict with Georgia, only one vessel was detained briefly for 2 hours. Now we have 10 ships registered as violators of the Crimea port treatment, and 4 of them have been arrested. It is already a beginning of something. And some might say that, say if we take Crimean judges, it is for them to decide where they want to stay as long as they continue fighting for or defending rights and freedoms of people. This is not the case, because they are traitors indeed, and they may not be fully fledged judges if they betray their country to stay there to work as collaborators. And they're really collaborating with the Russian Federation on these matters. And the first law on occupied territories that we made with due regard to situations in Georgia and in Transnistria it is not limited to this humanitarian approach. We need to continue with finding ways to reclaim the Crimea. It is really important to see this book being published, to provide more details, more factual information about that period. More books, more documentaries need to appear here to continue this work, to prevent the aggressor to feel at home on our land. The aggressor needs to understand he will never ever feel home in such a situation.
Thank you, Georgiy. Sevgil Musaeva-Borovik was one of those people who covered the events in the peninsula from the first days of annexation. Sevgil and me, we come from the Kerch district, and actually this was the entry point for the Russian soldiers. The Tatar people, Crimean Tatar people, are the most organized group which is counteracting to the special forces. And the story of Rishata Mehta, my father of 3 small children, small kids, he actually was a hero of Ukraine because he went to make a picket himself alone, and he was kidnapped and then killed. Actually, this is the first demonstration counter Putin's statement that the Crimea was annexed bloodless, and also there are several other people, we mentioned their names, they disappeared, they were kidnapped during the annexation, and we know nothing about them now. Sevgil, could you make some personal comments? Sitting here, I read the texts which are coming around, and very recently I asked my colleague to write about the summer season in Crimea, and she writes, you know that the situation is being cemented today. The Crimea is not ours, but the Crimea is not theirs. Emotionally, it's very difficult for me to speak. I never could imagine that this could happen to your native land. I used to take Crimea as my native land because despite that I was born in Kazakhstan, but I always believed that Crimea is my native land. When the annexation started, I was at home. I was preparing the launch of my HUBS project, and I received a call from my American colleague who asked me the telephone number of Rafat Chubarov. I asked what was happening, and she said, you know, there are some separatist events in Crimea, and she responded that the situation is rather serious in Crimea. I did not take it seriously at that very moment. For me, Maidan was the most important event, and I simply oversaw the processes which were going on in Crimea, although my mother attracted my attention to them. When 2 days later the protests near the Supreme Soviet buildings, the Supreme Council building started. And then several days later, I saw that green men, people standing near the walls of the administrative buildings. We created, my friends and me, we created a group in Facebook. It was 2 days later after fly of Kurchenko. We immediately launched our information channel, our news describing what was going on. And we immediately understood that the news bulletin is not enough. Immediately upon decision of the Russian Duma on March 1st, we created the hotline. The first call was from an artist who told me that he wanted to relocate to mainland Ukraine because he was scared of the Russians coming, and soon after annexation of Crimea and situation in Donbass, we have now 1.2 IDPs. And for me, that story started with Rustam and his family, who called first. Speaking about human features, human qualities, and this, for me, this was the demonstration of the real human nature. In general, this was the story of mutual help and mutual assistance among people from the very first days of March. People called to me, people sent money, we bought products, our women, they cooked food and took it to the Ukrainian military who were blocked in their military, in the territory of their military units. And when we started to relocate people from Crimea, I received a lot of calls and messages from families who suggested to give shelter to IDPs. By the referendum, it seemed to me that it was not serious. On March 17, when there was official signing of the documents, I even did not believe. Recently, one of my psychologists told me that this event, when you have lost the Crimea, could be compared to the loss of your close relative, and that's why it's very important to have now this book. It will be very useful to read it once again, to realize what has happened. Thank you, Taras, for this book.
Thank you. First and foremost, because without accounts of witnesses, it would not be possible. And the emotions that are there anyway is the key point. I still remember the words by Asid Ablayev, who said that lavender smell is the first association for him of the Crimea. And I do want to make everything possible to let him smell the lavender there. Once again, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. If no, then I may ask our participants. And you know, the most important point that I came across while writing the book was unwillingness among some to say facts and truth. Nevertheless, I think that people who failed to make timely decisions in this period have to be criminally responsible, not just administratively, but criminally as well. And Dmytro Tymchuk was correct in saying that, strangely and surprisingly enough, no commission, whether parliamentarian or other, has ever been established to investigate into the period of Crimean annexation and those killings during that time. You know that the Commission on Kennedy's assassination remains secret up to this moment, though the American elite still has some already has some clues as to who was the culprit, though there are still discussions and deliberations whether it was about special services or mafia or others, but nevertheless, some information is there. And I think that our task for today is to help people like Georgiy Logvynskyi to see the issue of the Crimea kept alive rather than weeping about it. We need to make sure that the life of perpetrators of the crime is never the same. We need to think of millions of people who had to leave the Crimea after that, and I think real numbers, I'm almost sure, are much higher than official statistics or the UN statistics on that. And I will gladly see every one of you at the presentation of this book, which will happen in 8 days during the Lviv Book Fair. After that, there will be a roadshow of the book. We'll start on 15th of September in Kiev and go around the country. We will go to universities, to public libraries with it. And if you have any final remarks, you're welcome. If not, then we are going to wrap up. I would only add here that the key task is not just to see that lives of the traitors will never be the same after that, but we also need to support those people in need of support of the state because of their ruined lives. And we need to check for violations of human rights and freedoms. Whenever we see some illegal persecutions there, whether it was a search of property or seizure of personal belongings or arrest, etc., we need to check for it and we need to follow this case. Because at the very least, a person who sees armed security officers breaking into his property, this man should say that, okay, I will gladly let you search my premises, but just be reminded that this constitutes a crime and you will be punished for that. Unfortunately, this is a frequent case situation in the Crimea. Our efforts and those of NGOs and human rights organizations, and you, by the way, should know that human rights organizations may not operate in the Crimea now. So their efforts are mostly aimed not at support to IDPs, but more to support people who have stayed in the Crimea, keeping their convictions, beliefs and interests. Those who remain pro-Ukrainian while de facto living there. These are the ones who suffer and will suffer the more. I do remember guys in Kerch that managed to raise Ukrainian flag and they put the photo of that on their Facebook and they were arrested for that. We had 3 Crimean Tatar activists kidnapped 3 days before And I think we also need to cover these stories. During a recent Lviv media forum, I asked the audience who of those present knows about the case of Iskander Nubiyev, TV cameraman. A couple of hands appeared, and I asked about the case of Anna Andreevska, banned from entering the Crimea and being sued for extremism because of her publishing an article on the Crimea battalion. It was probably about 8 hands in the air, which says how little journalists know really about things going on in the Crimea. And there are many more cases to follow, like the one of the ITR TV Crimean Tatar channel there. So there are some efforts from the state and on behalf of the OSCE, but still it is just a superficial little reaction. Surely it wouldn't stop Crimean authorities, who were very keen and close in this TV channel, but nevertheless people need our support and they want it.
See you in Lviv on the 11th. The sponsor, Alexander, will be moderator, will be facilitator of our presentation in Lviv. The book will appear in bookstores after the Lviv Publishing Forum.